So this presentation, this conference paper that I submitted to this year's System Dynamics conference is basically just a small personal side project for me. And the idea for it sort of sprang up in my head while I was doing a Vipassana meditation retreat in Nepal last year. And during this course, we spent the days obviously practicing meditation, but every evening we had a video lecture, recorded video by the principal teacher of the technique, where we learned a little bit about the philosophy and the theory behind the technique. And I remember while listening to these lectures, I kept noticing clear signs of stock flow thinking, feedback thinking, and endogenous thinking, which was quite amazing for me, thinking that the theory goes back 2,500 years ago. So I kept developing in my head this very simple system dynamics model that tries to capture the theory behind this technique. And this paper is what came out of that. So I'm going to start with a quick introduction to Vipassana meditation. I'm going to take a brief look at the scientific literature on meditation, and then I'll introduce the very simple system dynamics model, and we're going to look at a few simulations of the model, and I'll wrap up with a brief conclusion. I hope I'm going to be able to stick to time. If I overrun, please feel free to interrupt me. So Vipassana, or Vipassana as it is pronounced in the original Pali language, which is the ancient language of India, means something like to see things as they really are, and it has been translated to insight, for example, or introspection. And as a meditation technique, it is believed to have been developed and taught by the Buddha around 2,500 years ago in India. And much later in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was rediscovered and revived by Buddhist scholars in Burma, or present-day Myanmar. But more recently, a former Indian industrialist by the name of S.N. Goenka, he had great success in spreading the technique, not just in his home country of India, but also in many, many countries around the world. And he established a non-profit organization that teaches this technique mainly in 10-day retreats, where during the days you follow, you sit in a meditation hall together with other students, and you follow recorded audio or video instructions by Goenka, the teacher. And it is said to be a non-sectarian technique. Obviously, you're not required to convert to Buddhism or anything like that to be able to benefit from it. So during this time, students are required to remain within the site and also to observe a number of precepts, such as noble silence, for example, including no talking to anyone, also no reading, no writing, as well as celibacy and abstention from all intoxicants. And the course starts with a sort of introductory meditation technique called Anapana meditation, or mindfulness of breathing, where you are instructed to focus on your entire attention on your breath, your natural and normal breath as it comes in and goes out. And this is thought to sharpen and quiet the mind and prepare it for the actual Vipassana meditation that comes later on during the course, starting on day 4. And for that, you're instructed to keep scanning your body from head to toe for normal physical sensations such as heat or cold or pressure, tension, whatever. And you start by noticing relatively gross sensations like pressure or pain, and working your way down to more subtle ones. And in that, you're asked to remain not just fully aware of the sensations, but also fully equanimous and non-reactive to these sensations. But what is this equanimity? It's worth spending a bit more time on it because it's very crucial to the theory and also to the model. What is meant by this equanimity is to try and not identify yourself with the sensations and experiences that you're having, and to just observe as these sensations arise and pass away. In the psychology literature, I think this is referred to as meta-awareness, or also cognitive or experiential diffusion, where you diffuse or detach yourself from the experiences and almost observe these as a third person. And it's similar to the concept of acceptance in modern mindfulness-based therapies, where you're supposed not to suppress the sensation or not to try and alter it in any way, but just accept it. And in this, you're advised to keep in mind the impermanent and transitory nature of all things, which is a central concept in Buddhism. It's called anicca in Buddhist texts. And it is believed that all human suffering emerges because people fail to appreciate this transitory nature of all phenomena, and therefore they become too attached to things and sensations that are inherently impermanent. So talking about the literature on this topic, there is really a vast amount of literature, and I haven't done a systematic review of that literature by any means, but just those which are most relevant to my work. I think the literature can be broadly divided into two categories. First one focuses on the psychological benefits of meditation, and the second one focuses on the actual physical and biological impacts of meditation practice on the brain. Now, in the first group, the psychological group, there is this 2012 meta-study which has found some good and robust evidence that meditation practice can have benefits with regards to the symptoms of anxiety and mood disorders, with regards to addiction, emotion regulation, pain management, and in general, mental and emotional health of individuals. But this study also concludes that we still need more precise theories and measurement devices to find out more about how and why meditation works. Now, in the second group of studies that focuses on the effects of meditation on the brain, there is another meta-study in 2014 which finds a number of brain regions that are consistently shown to be altered through meditation. And these include regions of the brain that have to do with meta-awareness, exteroceptive and interoceptive body awareness, have to do with memory, emotion regulation, as well as intrahemispheric and interhemispheric communication. And this study, although it highlights some methodological issues, overall it concludes that based on its review of the literature, there is a fair degree of regional consistency, and also in terms of the magnitude of the effects found, and also the aggregate mean magnitude of the effects that they find in the studies that they review. They find it similar to the aggregate size found in the other meta study that I referred to, the psychological one. Both of these point to medium to large effect sizes, both in terms of psychological benefits and in terms of effects on the brain, which point to practical significance for meditation. So in summary, there is a rapidly growing and vast body of literature but also there's still need for more rigorous literature, especially highlighting how exactly, what are the mechanisms behind how meditation works. And perhaps towards contributing to filling this gap, I decided to build this very simple system dynamics model based on the principal elements of Vipassana meditation. And this is, the theory can be found in this book called Vipassana Meditation, The Art of Living as Taught by S.N. Goenka, written by William Hart, but prefaced by Goenka himself. The main objective of this modeling practice is quite modest, actually. It's only to test the internal validity of the theory and to see whether the claimed results actually result from the assumptions, underlying assumptions of the theory. Before jumping into the model, I just need to introduce one more concept here, which is important and central to the model. According to Buddhist thought, when a person is faced with an external event or external stimulus, the mind goes through 4 processes, which might happen in an instant, but anyway, conceptually, you can think of it as first becoming conscious of the event or just aware of the event. Then perception occurs where you label the event or the sensation. You might label it as pain, for example, or as heat or cold. Then you make an evaluation of the sensation in terms of, is it pleasant or is it unpleasant? And finally, there is the reaction phase, which is important. It's also called sankhara in Buddhist texts. And this reaction can be either, if the sensation is pleasant, people tend to crave for more of it. And if it is unpleasant, they tend to develop an aversion towards it. And according to this theory, these sankharas or mental reactions are the source of human misery. And some of these are like lines drawn on the surface of water, so they disappear quickly. But others are more deep, they're like lines cut into stone with chisel and hammer. So they tend to leave lasting effects on the human psyche, let's say. And each one of us has a stock of already accumulated sankharas in our minds that continue to create suffering throughout the life. All right, so having a look at the very simple model, it consists of 2 parallel and basically identical structures, one for the sankharas of craving and the other one for sankharas of aversion down here. So it is sufficient to just understand one of these. They are basically identical. It starts here on the left-hand side with this variable gap between reality and expectations. As the person is exposed to the outside world, their reality either meets the person's, matches the person's expectations, or it can exceed the person's expectations, or not quite meet the expectations. If the expectations are exceeded, this is, I have conceptualized that this can create a pleasant sensation, potentially leading to craving for more of the pleasant sensation. And I have formulated this variable mathematically as just a normally distributed random variable that is normally distributed around an expected value of 0. So if the value is negative, it can create an unpleasant sensation and potentially turn into aversions. But whether or not these sensations actually accumulate in the stock of let's say, long-lasting sankharas, it depends on a number of factors. It depends on the person's level of awareness. So the higher the level of awareness, the more likely that the person becomes aware of this sensation, and therefore for it to accumulate. It also depends on the person's level of equanimity. So the higher the equanimity, the lower the likelihood that so if they can remain equanimous towards it and just observe as the sensation arises and passes away, it will not turn into a long-lasting. But importantly, it also depends on the level of already accumulated sankhara. So what is theorized is that a sankhara can give rise to fresh reaction both immediately and in the distant future, and each subsequent reaction becomes the cause of still further reactions. This is a quote from the book, and which is clearly describing a reinforcing feedback here. So that this is an important element of the model, which I've called reinforcing feedback of multiplication of miseries. Then you have the theory goes that in order to liberate yourself from these sources of misery, you need to start meditating, and that's how you can bring these sankharas to surface and just observe them as they pass away. So this is one effect of meditation, but at the same time, meditation has an effect on the person's level of awareness and equanimity over time. With practice, you can build up your level of awareness and equanimity, which can help you liberate yourself more rapidly from these sankharas. And this basically constitutes the balancing loops here that I've called liberation from miseries. Right, so what happens if we simulate the model? Looking first at the baseline simulation, where a non-meditator is compared to the meditator. The non-meditator is the red curve and the meditator is the green curve. And this basically follows the person throughout their lifetime from the age of, let's say, 15 to 75. And I've initiated this stock of sankharas of craving at an arbitrary level of 100, let's say, here. And this shows, unsurprisingly, that over time, if the person is unable to remain equanimous to pleasant sensations, then they tend to build up as sankharas of craving for more and more of these pleasant sensations. And this builds up consistently. It looks a bit linear, but in fact, it is the beginning of or in fact, it's a very slow exponential increase. On the other hand, if the person starts practicing meditation, let's say around the age of 25 and throughout their lifetime, then they can deplete this stock of sankharas of craving and liberate themselves from these sources of suffering. So far there is nothing too interesting here. In the first case, the reinforcing loop is dominant, and in the second case, the balancing loop is dominant. Now, what would happen if there is an external shock to the individual? Let's say between the ages of 25 and 35, the person goes through an exceptionally difficult period in their lifetime, and I've formulated this assuming a substantial drop in the mean or expected value of the random distribution that I have for a gap between reality and expectations. And this could be thought of as a period of long-term illness, for example, in the person's lifetime. Now, looking at this compared to the previous case, so the blue curve is basically a non-meditator going through life as usual. And here I'm showing the stock of sankharas of aversion. Now, the red curve shows the situation under this external shock. And obviously, throughout this 10-year period, we can see a much more pronounced exponential growth in the accumulation of these sources of misery. But also after that, what is more interesting is that the slope afterwards is visibly steeper than the previous case, which just shows that the accumulation of the faster accumulation of sankharas during this period has a long-lasting effect on the person's life. So the green curve shows what would happen assuming the person starts practicing meditation, perhaps under stress from this these stressful times, let's say around the age of 30, for example. Now, over time, if they manage to build these traits of awareness of and equanimity, then they can start to liberate themselves from these sources of misery. And after sufficient time, after several decades perhaps, there might be even better off than the non-meditative person who never went through that extremely difficult period here. But what is more interesting here is this period where we seem to have a worse before better situation. And this brings me to my final simulation here, which I have simulated a case of high awareness without matching equanimity. Now, the reason this came to my mind was that when you enter one of these 10-day courses, the organizers and the teachers really stress several times that once you commit yourself to the course, you need to keep going and you will not be allowed to leave the course. And the reason they give, or the analogy that they give for this, is that the course is like a surgical operation on the mind. And just as you wouldn't be able to leave in the middle of a medical surgical procedure, they can't allow you to leave in the middle of this either. But they don't really elaborate any further on why that could be harmful. After all, let's say if you attend only 3 days of 10 days, you should normally expect to get 30% of the benefits rather than being potentially harmed. Now, this simulation could show why that could be dangerous. As you might remember, I mentioned earlier in the presentation, in the beginning of the course, the first 3.5 days is spent on a mindfulness meditation technique, which focuses on sharpening your senses, or in other words, building the awareness trait, while working on the equanimity trait comes only later on during the course. So if you quit the course too early, you might end up with a higher level of awareness to your senses, but not a matching level of equanimity to be able to remain equanimous to those sensations. And this can create a dangerous situation where the person is much more sensitive to events outside stimuli, let's say, either pleasant or unpleasant, but is unable to remain non-reactive towards them. And in this situation, the reinforcing loop can become dominant, and you might notice much worse than normal development in the person's mental well-being. And that's why it is said that awareness and equanimity are like the two wings of a bird, and they need to be built up in parallel. So in conclusion, first of all, as I showed, there is a vast body of literature and quickly growing body of literature on the benefits of meditation, psychological and behavioral benefits, but also on the biological effects of meditation to the structure of the brain. And it is believed that Vipassana meditation can sort of foster selective adaptive responding to outside events instead of maladaptive impulsive responses to outside events. But at the same time, there is a recognized gap in our understanding of how exactly meditation works. And my hope in building this model was that the model, or a future more elaborated version of the model, could serve as a useful framework for investigating how, so in conjunction with the work of maybe neuroscientists or psychologists, it could serve as a framework for advancing our understanding of how meditation in general, or Vipassana meditation in particular, works. And obviously, being a very early stage personal pet project, let's say, there are lots of limitations in the work. Most importantly, for example, these traits of awareness and equanimity, I've modeled them like the improvements as a result of meditation. I've assumed a very simple linear improvements with the years of practice, while they should actually be stocks, and they will surely be developed. They will surely develop in a non-linear fashion over time, but that is something for the future. And also this concept of sankharas, which is very central to the theory and my model. I tried to find parallels of this concept in the psychology literature, but I wasn't very successful in that regard. So I think it needs to be better defined, and also the link between such sankharas and the level of person's level of well-being as posited by the Buddhist literature. This needs to be verified. So that's